We're live. Hey there, everybody. This is Kelly, Machine Bun Kelly, and Dr. Feigelding. He's an epidemiologist. Some of you may have gotten to know him like my wife did during COVID. He had a lot of very detailed and helpful instructions, and just keeping track of all the different disinformation and everything. And so I wanted to have him on the show, and he was gracious enough to accept that. So, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Eric? Or
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Kelly. As many people know, I'm an epidemiologist. I'm also a nutrition scientist. For those who get confused, I'm both because I did my doctorate doctors in both epidemiology and separately in nutrition when I was at Harvard. And so I worked in both realms. And I grew up I was originally born in China, but I grew up basically in Nebraska, South Dakota, and central Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania from elementary through high school.
Did you know Tim Walz? No, I'm just kidding. And
well, I have a connection to Nebraska. I feel very Midwestern and sometimes because of my Nebraska and South Dakota days.
Yeah.
And I think and even in Pennsylvania, because some people grow up near Philly or Pittsburgh, but that's a very different experience than central Pennsylvania where I grew up in.
Yeah.
It's rural America. And there, you try to tell people in the past, like, eat healthy. They don't really listen. So, in terms of like fighting disinformation, I know how some people get wrapped up in that because they don't listen to the elite bubble or, what ivory tower people will try to tell them about their healthcare or how to improve their health. So it's very difficult. But yeah, I grew up in that world. And so when I went to Hopkins from undergrad, I met people from, wealthy suburbia that I've never, ever encountered in my life. And it's like a completely different world. And trying to talk to them is almost as alien as, them trying to talk to someone from rural America. So in certain ways, I get the disconnect and, how people have a very different worldview based on who is their family and, friends around them where they grow up. And I think that's, helped in trying to reach across the aisle and trying to educate people from all walks of life, and not just give our ivory tower kind of like very scientific language, very, New York Times or higher type of, description of things that everyday Americans just don't get it, right? They don't really understand that complexity of certain messages. And so you have to like, simplify it for people. And, that's most people, so.
Right.
So, I've worked in health communication as well a lot. So I've done like years ago, I did a cancer campaign called the Campaign for Cancer Prevention. It was actually pretty big on Facebook. We're trying to educate people about cancer prevention, raise money for cancer research. I didn't take a dime of it; all went to our university hospital. But it grew. Like, this is like circa 2007. Like, this is still when Facebook was in its relative infancy, pre-IPO. And we had like this Facebook platform that grew 10,000 1 week, 500,000, 2 million in like a month, and eventually had like 6 million people. And so I still have a large Facebook page. I don't even use it anymore. It's but it's early on, that was like kind of like my practice territory of communicating, because that's when I first saw the conspiracies. Like, you scientists, elitists at Harvard are hiding the cure for cancer. By the way, it's vitamin B17. And I'm like scratching my head. Like, I work in nutrition. I've never heard of vitamin B17, nor that it's a magical cure for cancer.
Oh,
So this is like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine days. And I'm like, I've seen this rodeo before, right?
right.
Because when there's something really complicated, people sometimes just want to believe that there's a simple solution,
Mhm.
that cancer, there's actually a cure. It's just that the elites are hiding it, and there
That's the
isn't.
appeal of conspiracy theories, is that
Right.
bad things don't just happen because they happened. COVID didn't just happen to happen. It couldn't have just been an accident. There must have been some design by it and some evil ulterior motive, because then your brain can like figure out, who to blame and what to like. It
Right.
just
You want to
it makes
blame
the world
someone
easier
as
to cope
opposed to say it just occurred in nature. And I think it just occurred is, whether it's a lab leak of a natural virus or not. I don't want to get into that. It's
with.
not my favorite topic, but it's really hard for people to wrap that there's a random event that, just like hurricanes. Hurricanes are
Mhm.
pretty natural, but you saw what that happened in the last 2
Right.
weeks. There's now conspiracy theories over
So,
Marjorie Taylor Greene about, the elites created the hurricane or spurred the hurricane or changed the direction of the hurricane to affect, GOP voting areas. Like, come on.
it's
But you get it.
like I
But
used.
like, so I've seen the early days of those. Like, I've seen
Mhm.
every version of hiding the cure. There is an actual magical cure, by the way, by
Mhm.
my supplement product. Which, by the way, there are way too many YouTube channels that are like, let's take a break to, we're talking about this very serious thing. Let's take a break for my supplement powder or energy drink kind of thing. I'm gonna hawk.
Yeah.
And a lot of
Right.
that
Right.
stuff is just snake oil. I mean, there's some
Mhm.
snake oil that is just like you're wasting money. It doesn't do anything, or you're wasting money and it's harmful. But at the same time, there could be supplements that could be beneficial that is way cheaper than drugs. But we don't know because nobody out there actually tests for it in a rigorous way that FDA would actually accept. They just put a disclaimer, not been accessed by the FDA, and then boom, here, buy my supplement. But there's so much junk out there, and it's unregulated for most part, and it's just very sad. Anyways, I've seen all this rodeo before the era of COVID and COVID vaccines and every conspiracy under the sun with that. So I think, you know, 15 years of experience with that kind of like led up to this moment where I'm like, okay, I think I have to dig into this because the regular scientists some people are gonna, the conspiracy theory people are really good at pumping their conspiracies and stories. They're really good at storytelling, really good at discrediting or trying to discredit elites and scientists who know better than them. Because I think
Mhm.
people know, nobody wants to be told that you're dumb. I know better than you. You shut the hell up because you don't understand anything. Um, and trust the science. In certain ways, the general phrase "trust the science," I think people should trust in science, but
Mhm.
people I don't like the phrase "just trust the science." Like, you're too dumb,
Mhm.
just trust the science. I think the trust the science has been abused because, by the way, the right wing conspiracies oftentimes use trust the science because to mock science.
Mhm.
You know,
Right.
because I don't think that you should just trust on face value. Science is like, several iterations before it kind of settles into something, right? Like climate change, you're always going to find one huckster or one kind of like contrarian who says, actually the ice isn't melting in Antarctica or Greenland. But then, 99.9% of other scientists do. But, you know, they're always going to find, a random person. But oftentimes those random persons, um, you know, have some agenda or
They have
can
their
do their
supplements,
stories
so
really
to
well,
speak.
right? So
there's like I used to be an NBA writer for about a decade, and I'd always get these. I don't know if you're a big NBA fan or not, but I'd always
I
get
used
these
to.
fake. Get people to always want to send me. What do you think of this fake trade? And you're like, the Rockets should send so and so to for Philadelphia for so and so, and they run it through the ESPN trade machine, and it would technically work, but as somebody that's involved in the subject every day for 10 years, you can recognize like 11 different things that are just why it would never work, why it would never happen. And so, but I feel what you're saying about like you can't just say that that's stupid, it'll never work. But I think what happens is with what you're talking about, it's kind of like these guys become the ESPN trade machine where they take advantage of somebody's ignorance, and they feed them a little bit of information, and then that information makes the people feel informed. And so, you're just trying to hide this, or you don't know this, or real experts are saying this.
The contrarians are generally good at story, and the conspiracy theorists are generally good at storytelling. And I don't mean contrarian is necessarily always bad. I was the contrarian saying this is going to be a thermonuclear level pandemic the world has not seen in over 100 years, and millions of people are going to die in January 2020. But then, I think being contrarian isn't necessarily bad. But the conspiracy theorists are really good at telling a story, especially a very believable massage story, cherry picking a few things, and then explaining it in a very simple, dumbed down, overly simplified way sometimes to to a lay person, and then getting them to hook, line, and sinker buy into their thing. And I think what you will find, like, bad studies out there, bad research. Like some of the ivermectin research has been like recalled and been and actually been basically rescinded by the journals that originally published them. That doesn't stop people from still citing them or using them in meta-analysis to say, see, ivermectin worked. It just those are just early kind of stuff that's been retracted, but it's still out there. And also there's papers that's not retracted, but let's just say there's that one study that shows the more vaccinated you are, the greater the risk of testing positive for COVID. And now I'm going to just share half of that. So that's like the half that conspiracy theorists report. But they don't tell you the other half, that the more boosters and vaccine shots you have, the less risk of hospitalization and death, right? They only show you that other half, which sounds bad, but you realize, this is not a trial. This is real world data. So who gets boosters? People get boosters if you're very vulnerable, sick, or very concerned and have family members who are vulnerable, sick, right? And very COVID conscious. So these people, therefore, after they get boosters, they're the people who get boosters and more boosters, but they're also the people who test more, right? And so naturally, people who get boosted and vaccinated and boosted more are the people who test more and more conscious about this. And as a result, they test positive more often. So this is a surveillance bias. This is a classic epidemiology. But if you don't know anything about epidemiology, surveillance bias, and this confounding of boosted people test more, right? It looks like, the more vaccines you have, the more COVID you got, which is absolutely not the actual truth. Because if you actually look at hospitalization, which doesn't have surveillance bias as much, you see that those who were COVID positive, you see that those who were vaccinated more and boosted more had less hospitalizations and death, which is ultimately what really matters.
Based on the fact that they were the ones that had more concern, that were at greater risk. Does that amplify that? Does that make that distinction even broader?
Yeah. They're also at higher risk, so they're also more susceptible, and so and And to be clear, infection does matter, but here, and it matters for transmission, because even if you're healthy, you can transmit it to someone who isn't.
Mhm.
The issue here is that it's a surveillance bias. We see it all the time. Healthy people go get more colonoscopies. Healthy people go get educated and healthy people oftentimes get more mammograms as well. High risk people get screened for disease more often as well. So, all in all, like this surveillance bias kind of happens everywhere. Basically, the more educated you are, the more boosters you get. The more educated you are, the more you are to test. The more educated you are, the more often you get mammograms and more, colonoscopies and see the doctor more, right? And therefore get diagnosed with your disease earlier. Now, in epidemiology, we can actually correct for that in analysis if you have a good data set, but oftentimes they don't in most studies, and it just shows up like that. So my point about this is that people who don't understand the data and don't understand causation and epidemiology will basically say, aha, see, boosters make you more sick with COVID. And by the way, I want to tell people, the saying, correlation is not causation. That's actually not the full phrase. It's correlation is not necessarily causation, but every causation is a correlation. And basically, you have to tell the difference between that's a spurious, happenstance correlation, and that's causal. Like the best example is there's an old classic example we teach that, the more households use condoms, the more household appliances they have. So number of household appliances like big screen TVs, Xboxes, and condom use frequency, those are highly correlated. So does that mean if you use condoms more, you'll get more appliances? Or if you buy more household appliances, you're going to have more condom use? No, that's obviously not what's happening here. What's actually happening is that they're both correlated with wealth and socioeconomic status, right? And so that's why, because they're both correlated with that third thing, they have a correlation with each other. And this happens all the time. This is called confounding. Confounding is correlation due to another factor, but not causal. So this, people don't understand this. So, but again, correlation. So I see this sometimes with things that are correlated, they say it's causal when it's not causal, or things that is causal and the naysayers don't like the message, they'll just say, well, correlation is not causation, right? Like, and then confuses the hell out of people, because if you want to accept something or deny something, you just use one or the other arguments, and it's just complete disingenuous, and people are just confused. Oh, you have a very strong correlation. See, aha, more boosted, more COVID infections. Aha. But then, of course, you show them, more boosted, less hospitalizations. They go, aha, oh, that's just correlation nonsense.
Interesting.
And fighting this is it's like whack-a-mole, because you can find correlations with a lot of different things. And we're just going to skip over the fraud and of some of the ivermectin studies. But I think this is what makes science so difficult to communicate, because some small studies might not find out something because they're small. Some bigger studies could not find it, or could find something, but then they're biased because they didn't count for this testing bias, for example, the surveillance bias, or confounding. And this kind of shit happens all the time. And that's why you need like scientific consensus to say, oh, this does seem causal. And in certain ways, like smoking early on, back in the 50s and 60s, a British doctor study, the Framingham Heart studies, they all found smoking increases your risk of cancer, hypertension, heart attacks, strokes. But you know what? The cigarette company says that's just correlation is not causation. Wow. But obviously we do know that smoking causes like 99% of diseases under the sun if you study it long enough. But of course, we technically didn't have the true like nail on in the coffin evidence that smoking caused the DNA damage that caused the cancer until the 1990s, like mid to late 90s, which is wild. But fortunately, the Surgeon General report put out something back in the 1960s. Bless the 1960s, in certain ways, you know, America, the world was a very different, weird society, of course, but there's no disinformation back then, right? If the Surgeon General
Right.
put out a report that, you know, smoking causes cancer and many diseases, that's when, you know, a lot of the anti-cancer, anti-smoking, you know, agenda and movement started in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But had we waited until we had the bona fide evidence till the 90s, it would have been too late. So, but early on, it was just a correlation, but we think it's causal. Anyways, this is the world we live in. In certain ways, the data moves very fast, and then the lay people will hear a spin of whatever the latest research comes out, good or bad quality. Yeah, they don't really care as long as someone explains it to them. And I think this is where I'm trying to be very careful. Like, you know, I'm like trying to like drive like a center. Like, I don't dismiss like new ideas. Look, if I dismissed new ideas, I wouldn't have put my head out on the chopping block in early 2020 to say this is COVID's going to be thermonuclear level bad. But I do hate the people who tried to, like, you know, grift off of pumping some, you know, miracle treatment, because I've seen it with cancer. I've seen it with so many other things over the years, especially if you have a platform big enough, and you see every single conspiracy under the sun that people are trying to push out there. So I think, you know, my early days kind of like trained me for whenever this COVID came along. It's like, of course it was gonna, this kind of disinfo was gonna come along at some point, you know.
So what what I find helpful is you're giving us some ways to look at the data to find out, is this a legitimate critique, or is this just somebody that didn't know what they're talking about is leaning out? Like, I like is peer review, like I know there's a lot of people
peer review is very flawed, by the way. Like, I think you shouldn't just rely on one study, because first of all, there's something called the publication bias, is that if something is sensational, it gets published fast and usually in big journals. But if you found nothing, let's just say you found this gene and it found nothing, you wouldn't even report it or publish it. It's just like, there's millions of things in your DNA that we could report that is correlated with XYZ disease, and you only report the interesting ones. But if it doesn't correlate with anything, you never write up anything about it. And so this kind of thing happens with all things in science. If it's sensational, interesting, obviously you publish it. But oftentimes there's like 10 times more studies out there that could be published that found nothing. But they don't bother publishing it because they don't find anything. So you can't just rely on just one study normally, especially it's like a brand new topic where there's like one study and it's like, oh, and it's like going against all of convention. Sometimes the reason that paper got published is because it is so different or so new or so novel and so weird that but it gets easily debunked once you see it elsewhere. You know, like, for example, there was one finding during the pandemic that said like there was one small study that said that the Pfizer vaccine increased the stroke risk in men. Pfizer vaccine, stroke risk, men. Now, is that true? So basically, quickly, the US government and international collaborators, they want to verify if it's true or not. So they start checking other data sets. UK started checking theirs. Israel started checking theirs. European Union started checking theirs. The US VA administration checked theirs. Several other large studies checked their databases. Did the Pfizer vaccine increase stroke and increase stroke in men? And, you know, it didn't get confirmed in any of them. As in, like, they found nothing. right? But that one small study you can find. Now, what happened was that one study had was like data dredging, data mining. So data mining is when you like just p-value. I don't know. It's called, some people call it p-value hacking. When you just look for like just raw correlations, like find me any correlations with anything. And so what they were doing is find any correlations with the vaccine and any outcome in this small data set. And of course, over time, you're going to find a significant result. And by the way, significant just usually means like, you know, 0.05, 5% chance or less of it being an accident. But if you flip, that's basically 1 in 20. So basically, if you do something enough, you're going to find random signals that pop out that doesn't really mean anything. And so
I had a statistics professor in college. For people that don't really understand what you're saying or what that we had this statistics professor that we had, our first assignment was we had to go home and flip a coin 1,000 times and then record the results. And of course, he knows some people are going to go home and actually do the assignment, and some people are just going to go home and just randomly like write HT or whatever. And he got everybody's reports, and he would look at the paper for a couple of seconds, and he would either write A or F. He would know immediately whether or not you actually did the assignment. And it's because of what you're talking about. When you start getting a large enough group, there are going to be random things that happen more than you would expect. Like, and so he was looking, I think it was for 7 heads in a row, or 7 either heads or tails in a row. And if he saw a string of 7, he'd be like, yeah, that person really did it. Because it's the kind of thing that's going to happen statistically,
just by random chance.
The kind of thing that you're going to think is going to happen. You're going to be like, oh, no.
So this kind of thing happens often, and in epidemiology, one small data set finds a correlation between vaccine and some outcome, right? Especially if you start chopping thinly in a subpopulation, because then you're giving the data more chances to find a signal. But it doesn't get confirmed. But the issue is like, if you publish just based on one study, it sounds like it increases stroke risk in men, but it doesn't, because the larger studies all don't find it. Now, the conspiracy theorists is like, the big institutions are hiding it, the deep state, the elitist class, the vaccine pushers are trying to. No, it's just that's just how data works. We check something and then we verify it. Do you find it elsewhere? If you find it elsewhere, in all the things, you pull the data together, and it's like, oh, this is legit, Or if it doesn't check out, it's like, oh, that initial thing was just a random signal, and once you average them out, it just gets washed out because it's not a major thing. So,
is there ever any validity to doing one of those data mining searches? Can positive things come out of that, or is that just
you can sometimes find them, but you have to have a very higher threshold than 1 in 20. 1 in 20 is 5%. You have to have like a 3, 4, 5 sigma kind of things. Like physics uses like 4, 5, 6 sigma. Sigma as in like standard deviations way. 2 sigma is about 5%. So you need like several of them for you to be like really confident of the results. But I cite that Pfizer stroke thing that was debunked because some people ran with it. Some people are like, CDC had one small study that found it. It's a CDC report. But then, they neglect to mention that it was basically not found, in any of the large global data sets that also in other countries, or even in the US, other data sets in the US, it's just not found. But the people who want to sell you like this sensational result, they will cherry pick. They will cherry pick that one study, and then and they will cite, this is peer reviewed, or this gene causes XYZ. But then, quickly everyone publishes a confirmation or debunking studies that says, we don't find it, we don't find it, we don't find it, we don't find it. Just that one study found it because of publication bias or sensational bias, whatever you want to call it. This is always happening. If you see something that really is a sensational story, you have to ask, is this truly a pattern or a one-off event, right? But on Twitter and social media, one-off events that are really, really crazy, gets a crazy finding, gets a lot of attention. But that's not how science works. Science works through, like, initial exploratory, but then is it confirmed? Like, do other people see it? Like, is this legit? As in, is there a consensus around this? But that's not how the media works. The media works on crazy sensational stories that will get clicks and headline attention. That's how all of media
Especially
works.
when that media has a narrative that it's trying to create.
Right. And then they cherry pick whatever that is favorable to their narrative. Like Joe Rogan had this, it increased pericarditis. It does a little bit, but compared to the actual risk, by the way, this is like the Johnson & Johnson shots and and some of the early shots, but a little bit, but the actual risk with COVID is so much bigger. And some of the adverse events you initially saw with the vaccines, you didn't see it with the boosters, because what happens is, I think the one thing, I'm a fair person. The one mistake in the vaccine with COVID was that the initial spacing was too close together. It should not have been 3 or 4 weeks. 3 weeks Pfizer, 4 weeks Moderna between first and second shot. They should have made it like at least like 2 months or 3 months before at least the second shot. And so some people did have a little bit stronger reaction with the second shot because it was so close together. But once the booster rollout was like 1 year, your boosters like 1 year rollouts after the previous, these things all disappeared. So, I'm not saying mistakes weren't made. And I think AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, in hindsight, were not the best vaccines because they had much higher adverse rates. But in the middle of the pandemic, those risks are tiny compared to, say, actually getting COVID, right? And not getting vaccinated. So I think, and no one really on social media talks about, well, let's talk about the risk balance, because there's risk to everything. Oral contraceptives, the pill that millions of people, billions of people around the world take. Technically, they do carry a small risk of stroke. They do carry, especially if you smoke, they do carry other small, hormonal disturbances. But in totality, it's useful. Advil, ibuprofen. Ibuprofen actually increases heart attacks. I'm gonna say it. Like, this is well established. This is published in JAMA. This is well known that ibuprofen, which is Advil, and diclofenac, which is not used in the United States, but used it's another NSAID. It's kind of like Advil. It increases heart attacks and other cardiac events. But they're still sold on the market because if you're in acute pain, you do need to take these drugs. So the long-term risk of heart attacks is small, but it's not zero, right? And I think we have these kind of like risk trade-offs all the time. Are we recalling, all Advils? No, we're not. Tylenol. Tylenol does hurt the liver, especially if you drink. So don't ever drink alcohol and take Tylenol. Acetaminophen, aka paracetamol, depending on where you are in the world. But we still have them because people need to, get their fevers down, right? Like, there's no drug that is like completely flawless. Even aspirin. Aspirin lowers your heart attack and stroke risks. That's well proven in clinical trials. And it's actually recommended to take aspirin against heart attack and strokes if you're high risk. But it also causes stomach bleeding. You'll get ulcers.
Wow.
And you get that with Advil as well, by the way. But like nothing's like completely risk free. But for the risk balance and the usage, the reason you take the oral contraceptive, for example, it's useful for many important health reasons, right? And this is the world in which we live. But the people who want to spread this disinfo, or the people who want to just try to push you against the narrative, ooh, they could technically spin aspirin. Did you know it causes stomach bleeding and ulcers? Advil causes heart attacks. Tylenol causes liver failure. Technically, in rare circumstances, long term, if you use it for a long time, yes, it does. But in the short term, for what you need to use it, it's safe. And I think this is where, the you just, if you just think about Advil, Tylenol, and aspirin, these are three of the most common medicines we use, right? Everyday pain medicines and fever medicines we use, and we give to kids. Technically, if someone wants to spin a narrative, they could, but it's not what is best for public health, because there's so many other reasons that these drugs are on the market. But the cherry picking of the results for vaccines are just insane, right? Like,
yeah.
And today, especially with these boosters, and we don't see those effects at all. And I don't get why. I don't understand why the RFK juniors of the world keep pushing it. Whenever think about the risk of so many other, not vaccinating against measles, that they're trying to also push now, because the anti-COVID vax has now spilled out into any vax, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually quite dangerous. Measles, actually, people forgotten how bad measles was, right? And measles, another thing is, how like if you previously have an infection and you fight it off, you actually have it, natural immunity. Well, natural immunity, by the way, the vaccine is also natural immunity, it just stimulates your immune system. But your infection acquired immunity you have infection acquired immunity against like thousands of pathogens. But if you get infected with measles, the horror of measles is that these memory cells that your body has is like, I remember I've seen this virus before, I've seen this bacteria before, I've fought you before, I can rally the troops and fight you off very easily the second time. Measles wipes that memory bank. So it destroys the memories of your infection, of the immune system, against all the pathogens that you previously fought. So
how does it do that?
That's like a 10x, 100x worse, because it's not just measles is debilitating and carries very high morbidity and mortality risk, but it also carries a risk of like deleting your memory banks of how to fight other pathogens. In certain ways, like remember how HIV is dangerous because it weakens your immune system, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's weakened so much that it becomes AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. That's when HIV is severe enough that you fall into AIDS. But in certain ways, like measles is also basically induces immunodeficiency, because it cancels your memory against how to fight all these other pathogens. And the anti-vax movement that has now become anti-any-vax is basically doing this to our public, our general public. It's insane. And, again, oftentimes they'll cherry pick one small either case report, which doesn't prove it's causal, again. And again, not everything is causal. Or if they find something and it's like the risk is very, very low, but compared to the other risk of not doing something, they don't ever teach you risk benefit balance, right? But it's all about the sensational story that they want to tell. And we're not even going to get into the hurricanes or other 5G kind of even wackier ones. But I think this is the world that we're in, where science works on this like slow horizon. You find an
Mhm.
initial study, you confirm it, but then in the world of social media, it's like a raging wildfire, and unless you're out there to debunk it, the raging wildfire will take hold in the public psyche with this dangerous message, and scientists are not normally equipped to fight against that. But
So like,
they're not taught how to do that. I had to self teach because through all those years of fighting disinfo on my cancer campaign.
mhm. With the so I'm just thinking about what you're saying, and it seems like COVID created a perfect storm because it was such a serious disease and it was killing so many people. We were incentivized to rush the research in a way, and that just allowed the skeptics to double down on the research. So, just wondering
Well,
what your
well,
thoughts
not
are
that
on
not the research
Operation
was
Warp
like
Speed and
like when people say rush, people think, oh, you do a half-ass job,
right,
slapdash kind of
right,
job.
right. That so like
Uh,
Operation Warp Speed. I think
yeah.
people misunderstand that.
Yeah, Operation Warp Speed is a more like like warped amount of money, and because normally, the reason vaccines take sometimes a decade or 2 decades to develop for rare diseases is because the money pipeline is so slow. The grants, the application,
Mm,
the process approval, and the application for the IND to start the trials, it is just enormously slow and tedious because there's very little money for most of these diseases. But Warp Speed basically put it as a national priority, and we put like billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into it. And of course, like, it was all hands on deck to get something done. And when you have all hands on deck and you have hundreds of billions of dollars, of course things will get done much faster than if you're just barely getting by as a poor scientist begging around for grants and to do these research of oftentimes neglected tropical diseases that there's no real market for in the United States. They're not like Ozempic type of or market or pandemic level emergency around a
mhm.
lot of these diseases, and so that's why they're called neglected tropical diseases. And that's why it takes like 10, 20 years to develop vaccines for them, because people are literally scraping by pennies to even get it off the ground. I think that's the world we live in. And I think it's really sad that, by the way, there are like bona fide scientists like at Stanford who are, a little bit weird on certain topics, and they get platformed. There's Scott Alice's, Scott Alice's of the world, and the Joe Latipos of the world. They exist. Just because you have an MD doesn't make you a research scientist, nor does it make your opinions the only opinion out there, and nor is it the scientific consensus. And
Mhm.
being a doctor in itself, you're not trained in research. I went to medical school. I dropped out. Had enough doctorates on my belt. Had other things in life I wanted to do, but in medical school they don't teach you. They don't teach you research. Research methodology is not really taught, nor how to
Mm,
evaluate it, nor is it like the consensus or how to systematically analyze them. Like this is not taught in medicine at all. And every doctor who only has a medical degree and not any other research degree basically is a self-taught person. And now, nothing against self-taught per se, but there's so much more to, remember the saying, correlation not causation. It's actually correlation is not necessarily causation, but every causation is a correlation. And the difference in knowing them is, causal epidemiology. And it's a mess. It's a mess because like it's kind of like we don't have like the perfect, in certain ways you can design perfect physics experiments, right? Like with
mhm,
super precision and super precise chemistry experiments, that you can isolate every other variable, and
mhm,
and you can do super good like laboratory petri dish research. But when it comes to human trials of, especially living out in the real world, get vaccinated, go in the real world, and then or take a drug, go in the real world, or eat some food, go in the real world, and then live your life. And there's a gazillion different other things that happen in your life. Trying to tease out causation is not for the faint of heart. It's not easy, but it's possible. This is literally what we do as epidemiologists. But it's not as it's noisy, and I think. But there are people out there who are really, really bad actors who are trying to exploit the noise to gin up whatever conspiracy that's out there.
What about since you're also a nutritionist, and we've got about 15 minutes left. What about you had mentioned food supplements and how a lot of those are just snake oil. Is there a case for nutrition in healthcare, but because there's not the money to research it, that it just doesn't get researched? I know of a doctor
nutrition. There is nutrition research. The issue is there's no money oftentimes comparatively for supplements. Like, think about drugs. You patent the exact chemical formulation most of the time. Mm-hmm. Or you patent an insulin injector with a little pen, or some EpiPen that. Anyways, nutrition, oftentimes you can't patent vitamin C, for example. You can't patent like a natural occurring compound. That's generally the rule, right? If it's naturally occurring, you can't patent it. It's not, you didn't invent it. But you can patent the extraction, of course. But so oftentimes, and again, the FDA rules since the early 90s was that they're not going to regulate supplements. You just put a disclaimer, this statement has not been evaluated by FDA, and then they can sell horny goat weed or whatever random supplements out there without much research. Now, some will do research, but oftentimes it's voluntary.
I wonder how many people want to try horny goat weed right now, I think.
No. Oh God, what have I done? It's already for sale. I'm saying there's no real good long-term evidence, like, phase 3 clinical trial evidence for things. I think, look, nutrition is beyond not just supplements. There's also food, like trans fat. Do you remember how we got rid of trans fat years ago? Because we realized trans fat is actually worse than saturated fat. And saturated fat is not healthy. It's not the worst thing. It's not healthy. Like, it's all relative, because we all have to eat, approximately 2,000 calories, depending on how much you exercise, your metabolic efficiency, if you're Michael Phelps or not. But if you tell someone like eat avocados, they're healthy. True, avocados are healthier than bacon, right, or sausages. But if you eat 50 avocados a day and consume 5,000 calories, that's also not healthy. Because nutrition, you have to eat. It's just like you have to breathe. It's all about what you substitute it for. If you substitute, say, avocado for, say, spinach, and it's probably a wash. But if you substitute avocado for sausages or butter, right, then it's healthy. And similarly, like, there's debate about Diet Cokes, sugar sweetened beverages, aspartame. Well, it's healthier than full sugar drinks, but is it as healthy as water? No. But the thing is, if you tell people don't drink full sugar drinks, oftentimes they won't switch to water. Or if you tell people don't drink Diet Coke, they oftentimes the choice between Diet Coke, water, or regular Coke, people will go to their sugary drink. Yeah. Well, but by the way, the other thing is, like, people say, well, jelly beans. If your sugar is bad, shouldn't we therefore ban jelly beans? Why are you trying to, tell us not to drink Coke? Why don't you tell the candy companies? I think that candy is not the healthiest, but Halloween, you can enjoy some. Just don't overdo it, and try to also eat healthy things as well. But sugar sweetened beverages, what people don't realize is years ago there was a sugar sweetened beverage versus a jelly bean study. And the jelly bean, so they're matched in calories. There's no other nutrients, no fiber, right? No fat or nothing. It's just pure sugar. But if you eat a jelly bean, you eat it, and then again, you have only a certain amount of calories per day. If you eat a handful of jelly beans, you're going to skip part of lunch or skip part of dinner later because you had a lot of calories. You displaced other calories, as we would say. But if you drink sugar-sweetened beverages, the same amount of calories as this handful of jelly beans, your body doesn't eat less later. What it means is basically your body isn't sensing that it ate, say, 500 calories of this jelly bean sugar, if it was in liquid form. Basically, liquid form sugar is like metabolic poison because it evades detection by your system because it's dissolved. It's dissolved.
Is it the same like with orange juice?
Yeah, this is true for orange juice as well. Like lemonade. Don't drink full calorie lemonade or full calorie OJ. Always dilute it. And trust me, before you take a sip, if you dilute the OJ, dilute the lemonade before you drink it, you wouldn't even know it's diluted because your receptors don't work like that. If it's super diluted, yeah. But if it's like 50% or 2 to 1 diluted with water, you probably won't even notice that it's diluted that much. Barely any. And I think people don't realize that sugar-sweetened beverages for kids especially are as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than some of the most unhealthy things. And because it causes you to overeat. Because again, jelly beans, it's a lot of candy, but then you'll eat less later, right? You're going to eat 500 calories less later. But if you eat 500 calories now at say 4 p.m. But with sugar-sweetened beverage, your body doesn't compensate that because it doesn't sense all the calories. It doesn't sense 100% of the calories that's in this cup of SSB, sugar-sweetened beverage. And I think this is where, there's so much more in nutrition as well. And there's also a lot of this weird anti-seed oil stuff. There's so much we do know about nutrition already for preventing heart disease. And it's just as some of them are just as effective as taking a lot of these statin drugs. But of course, it's easier to pop a pill, right? That's the American way.
Right.
But I think there's so many things we can do, and of course, there's food coloring additives that we can remove, pesticides, microplastics. There's so many things where nutrition, environmental health intersects with medicine, because food is medicine as well, but food is obviously much more complicated as a medicine. Like everyone needs to eat. That's the other thing, and I think some people don't realize, but I think the diet that people eat is as important, if not more important, than most medical treatments that we have out there. It just we don't like to talk about it because nobody likes someone being a food police, right?
Right.
So it's just like, don't tell me what to put in my body. That attitude with some people also spills over to nutrition. But of course, it's easier to talk about these chemicals we add. Like there's a lot of additives that we add that are very unhealthy. But beyond just the additives, these pollutants, there's so much in nutrition. And not all things are alike. For fruits and vegetables, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflowers, Brussels sprouts are much healthier than, say, iceberg lettuce. But when you ask the average American to eat vegetables, they're like, I had lettuce tonight. You had an iceberg.
I got you. No.
Anyways, there's so much more we can chat about, but I think the message is that there's so much misinformation, disinformation out there. You have to be really careful. And at the same time, I'm also a proponent for just watch for emerging data and see if it checks out, if it's confirmed, right? Just don't jump on the first thing you hear, especially if it's like, not in a top medical journal and especially if it's not endorsed by, the medical establishment or the scientific community. And I think this is where the lay public should be very careful. I think there's a lot of emerging long COVID research that's very interesting, right? I think one study is very fascinating. I think we need more studies on certain topics. And I think I'm glad and hopeful that, there will be a lot more big long COVID research that's coming out in the next few years. And hopefully we realize how big of an impact COVID has on our lives and that we shouldn't just minimize it.
I think there's going to be, in the coming 10, 20 years, almost an epidemic of people who have long-term long COVID that can't work, and it's going to have some real effects. But anyway, you said I wish we could go on, but you have a hard 1 o'clock, you said, and it's
I have to leave soon, but happy to chat more another time. We can do it next month or something if you want. But I think there's so much. We clearly have just basically barely started touching upon, and I used to teach entire courses on some of these topics, a week on each topic. But I think people be careful of the information out there, and listen to Fauci and stuff like that, and medical experts. But at the same time, during the emerging eras, what the medical establishment is also slow to accept that, for example, COVID is airborne, right? There's asymptomatic transmission with COVID. That long COVID could be long-term debilitating. A lot of this stuff, it takes time for a lot of this stuff to bear out, and one study doesn't prove it definitively. But we have to have this balance where we shouldn't always rely on whatever is confirmed 5-10 years from now. But if we see consensus building around an area, I think investigations are proving it, in multiple countries, then I think it's real, right? Again, just like that one vaccine and stroke example in men. If you don't at first, just go, If you hear the one time, think, just wait until you hear, is it confirmed? Is it confirmed in multiple other studies? And I think, but also keep your ears to the ground of what's emerging, but don't be careful of the messenger. They're trying to hawk some, supplement powder merch. Right. Be very careful about that. Stay up to date. And I think it's a balance in this world. And there's lots of stuff that is dangerous. Don't drink alcohol and take Tylenol, for God's sakes, people. Stop doing that. It's really, really bad. But at the same time, the medicine is still on the market because it's still really important for fighting your kid's fever.
Taking because Tylenol is usually what people are going to take for their hangovers too. So
well, hangover is different. It's the next day, but still, it's still not great. You're still taxing your liver with both. And there's also, by the way, there's a whole market about post-hangover medications. I'm not sure about some of them. There's really lots of herbal extracts. I'm I don't know if that's really proven to cure your hangover. This is where there's a lot of murky stuff in the supplement world. I'm not anti-supplements. I'm just anti, dubious claims, unless you have to bring the proof, right?
Right. So thanks a lot, Doc. Wish we could talk for another hour, but I got to let you go. Really appreciate you coming on. I learned things, and that's what my favorite thing to do. So appreciate your expertise.
We need more creative people, intellectually curious people like you out there. Stay safe.
All right. You too. Thank you. All right. So